All right. So for our final lecture, we're going to look at immigration. Um, and this is going to be a little more broad, kind of concentrated on both the 1800s, but also the going into the 20th century and late 20th century. So, essentially, the U.S. is populated by immigrants. Of course, there's the native population, um, but the bulk of the U.S. population in the present is descended from immigrants. I mean, I'm sure almost everyone in this class who is a U.S. citizen can, trace or knows the story of immigration, either from their parents, grandparents, great grandparents. Um, I mean, I would imagine that maybe there, they can. There is some family story about immigration. I mean, my family came from Canada. Some point in the late 1800s, came from Canada to LA. So, even that far back, we know we at least that one side of the family, we know we came from Canada. The other side of the family, Scotland at some point, Scotland or Ireland. Both to Los Angeles. Anyways, family history aside, which I don't know if I mentioned, but as my grandma gets older, she's letting it fly. She's letting all the stories out. So yeah, some interesting history there. I don't know if I talked about it, but the found out the great great grandpa was a sheriff that was murdered by his deputy in cold blood, over the sheriff's wife. Anyways, in the 1890s up in Ventura. Anyways, wild stuff. All right. Anyways, so you have this. We have immigration is kind of ingrained in the U.S. History, and there is also a history of upward mobility. We'll see this starkly in the data that immigrants largely realize the quote unquote American dream. On average, there is incredible level of upward mobility. However, this is true for every wave of innovation or immigration, um, that there are that immigrants face discrimination or anti-immigrant attitudes, and this is true going all the way back to kind of the first non-English, non-Scottish, or non-British Isle large wave of migration from Germans. There's incredible anti-German sentiment in the 1850s. Then, of course, the anti-Irish sentiment, anti-Italian sentiment, all the way up, obviously, to the present. And the concerns are roughly similar across time. There are concerns about assimilation. Oh, how much will they adopt, the quote unquote American way of life? And there's concerns about impact on wages. We have more workers coming here. What's going to happen to employment opportunities and wages? So, concerns in recent periods about immigration oftentimes echo those from going all the way back to the 1850s. All right. Now, concerns about outgroup. You go society to from society throughout history. Societies are almost always hostile towards the outgroup. They're always suspicious and towards whatever the other may be. And the U.S. has this strain as well. What is rare is that the U.S. also has a strain of being very accepting and open to the outgroup, to immigrants. Most this attitude is most personified by the New Colossus, this poem by Emma Lazarus, which is ingrained in the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. Most represented in these lines right here. Um, your huddled masses yearning to bring free the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside my golden door. This is wild. This is not only this poem is like saying, not no, don't send your best, send whoever. We will take them. This is what's unique about kind of the American immigrant experience, is that you can find this. You can find plenty of anti-immigration sentiment, but you can find plenty of pro-immigration sentiment as well. This is something that is unique about immigration in the U.S. context. The U.S. still to this day has much more liberal immigration laws. It's very hard to immigrate here, and the paperwork is a nightmare. But compare that to most other societies um, around the globe, it's virtually impossible to immigrate to many of the places that we consider to be, countries that have their act together, or countries that, do well on a number of different outcomes. Try to move there. Believe me, during the pandemic, I tried to move to several of these places, and it is a difficult process to go through. Not saying the U.S. isn't, but the U.S. has in most cases much more liberal immigration laws than other places. Um, Again, this is kind of an exception. This is the American this in terms of American exceptionalism. This is an example of it. Although feel free to correct me if you can find evidence otherwise. Um, okay, now of what I mean by that is countries that have more liberal immigration laws. Now, of course, there is that anti-immigrant sentiment, even with this very poem. So we have this poem at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, and this is from the previous administration. But there was talk about replacing the poem, or certainly downplaying the poem. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to go through background of just the overall history of immigration. We'll talk through why someone would migrate, who migrates, and then we'll look at what happens to the immigrants once they reach the U.S. So here's the overall history. So when you think about immigration, you're going to have the stock and you're going to have the flow. All right. So again, what's the difference between stock and flow? If you think of a bathtub, the flow is the water going into the bathtub. The stock is how much water is in the bathtub. So this is the flow. This is the immigrants coming in. So foreign-born flow. So this is, again, how many people are coming here in a given year as a percentage of the population. So you can see the big waves of immigration are really in the back half of the 1800s. Okay. And then, kind of ramping up into the present. Okay. All right. The stock is going to be like how many foreign born, how many people in the US were born outside of the US. Kind of as you would expect, this is at a peak during the back half of the 1800s, falls. We'll talk about why this falls, grow, and then starts growing again. And as actually, this is all the result of changes in policy. Starts growing, and basically now we continue this up to the present. We are at the highest foreign-born percentage in the U.S. since basically ever since the 1800s. All right, now where the immigrants came from, that changes over time. So your initial sending areas, big sending areas, are northwest, northern and western Europe. So this is primarily from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Germany are your big waves here. Then we have the Southern European waves, which is your Italian immigrants. And then our most recent wave of immigration is primarily from Latin America and Asia. Okay. Here we have just largest group country of origin group in 1920. So this kind of tells you where the immigrants are going. So your German immigrants are settling through here. Your Mexican immigrants are settling through the Southwest, or many places they are already there. Post Mexican American War. And then we have, so these are going to be our Italian immigrants over here, Canadian immigrants up here. Look again by ancestry. You'll have here you'll have your German ancestry. You can see this kind of manifest itself. This is in 1920. This is the present. So you can see people descended of Germans are up here. People just categorizing themselves as American. This would be largely Scots-Irish, though, if we're looking at the biggest, where people originally, the sending country. African American through the South, Mexicans through here, and a little bit of German. No, French up here, which would be from Canada. Okay, so we have the original era of the original how people came to the U.S. is usually through indentured servitude in this initial period, the kind of initial, kind of colonial era into the beginning of the Republic. Then we have less migration in the early 1800s, and then we have mass migration in the late 1800s. Essentially, the doors are closed. Essentially, the U.S. heavily limits migration from 1920 to 1965. And then from 1965 to present, we have another era of mass migration, but there are more regulations around that migration. This period is from 1850 to 1920, virtually, it's close to open borders. I mean, it's not quite open borders, but it's close to what you would essentially, if you can get here, you can stay. Okay, so there's not many restrictions. We do have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first time an ethnic group is specifically excluded from coming to the U.S. If you study history, the Border Patrol is actually was actually founded to keep Chinese from coming across the Mexican border. That's its origins. And as we have these waves and waves of migration in the late 1800s, there starts to be those anti-immigrant voices, and there are a variety of uh, policies that are proposed to try to limit the migration. Okay, typically the form of some sort of literacy requirement. The presidents veto this, but finally, the Congress overrides the presidential veto, and we get heavily restricted migration from 1921 on. This is based, the quotas, each country gets a quota, and the countries are based on the existing population. So this will favor European migration, since the population is mostly descended from European migrants. And so you get kind of larger quotas for these northern, these older cohorts of migration than newer ones, and then the rest of the globe, very, very, very small quotas. In 1965, this immigration law gets reformed, and instead there are we have visas basically for skilled workers, and also for graduate students. Um, and we get family reunification. So essentially, the immigration policy changes to kind of carving out slots for um, family reunification, so extended family, and then also kind of skilled migration. And this facilitates that era of mass migration as large families and extended relatives are brought over. In addition to graduate students, and those graduate students enter the workforce with high skills, and so that is kind of leading to this era of mass migration that we have in the present. Okay, we'll take a break there. We'll talk about why migrate.